Welcome back to the show. I'm with Cory, Garnder, Barbra O'Brien, and Tom Tancredo. We're talking about whether or not Washington needs fixing, and we have already a diversity of opinion. But see, we can disagree so agreeably. And so one of my questions is, can Congress do that? Cory, you rattled off a list of huge problems. And certainly when the public looks at what's been going on in Washington, the fact that everyone's aware of these problems, the fact that the president had a commission to address many of these problems and ignored initially the commission's recommendations, as did the House and the Senate. And when you look at the fiscal cliff negotiations, where I think many objective people felt that the Congress and the administration kicked the can down the road once again, did not deal with 99% of the toughest problems. There's a sense that there's a sense that maybe Washington can't fix these problems, and that the House and the Senate and the President are going to continue as long as they can to try to avoid solving these problems.
Well, there's a couple things that are going to solve the problem for us if Congress doesn't. That's the credit rating of the United States. That's the solvency of this nation, the bankruptcy that this nation faces. $16 trillion in debt. Every man, woman, and child in this country owes $52,000 as their share. You go back to 1970. Since 1970, median household incomes have increased by about 24%. But spending over that same time period has increased by about 288%. The problem will solve itself, and that's when we can no longer borrow money to satisfy the spending cravings of this Congress, and that's going to increase interest rates dramatically, plunge this nation into a debt depression, and that's going to solve the problem for us. But that alternative is unacceptable, and that's why Congress must come together to cut spending, to put a balanced budget amendment in place, and to actually solve the biggest challenge this nation faces.
Okay, but we've known this for years. Why hasn't it happened?
Well, if you look at what happened last year, there was some at the margins reductions in the rate of increase of spending. It's simply not enough. In fact, it's not even close to being enough. And so I think you're going to see over the next few months a real battle in Congress. And I say battle not to talk about incivility. But I say these are issues that are near and dear to the hearts of people who were elected on either side of the aisle, Democrats or Republicans, who are going to be talking about issues that they came to Congress to either support or to change or to end. And over the next 3 months, we have a very real chance to get this country headed in the right direction by addressing spending. If we don't, we don't have 5 years or 4 years to control this spending problem, this debt problem this nation faces. We have this Congress. And I firmly believe that if we don't, you will see a debt depression far greater than anything Greece, Italy, or Spain have ever faced.
If the administration, for example, and let's say the Senate, but let's say the administration takes a position that we're not going to make the kind of cuts in spending that you feel are necessary, and that I think a lot of Americans feel are necessary. If they hold that line passionately as you describe, do you think the Republican Party would be willing to not increase the debt limit?
I think the Republican Party is going to look at it, if that's the case, if there is absolutely no willingness by this president to cut spending, no willingness by the majority in the Senate or the minority in the House to cut spending, then you're going to be looking at a partial shutdown of government. I think that will be a realistic thing.
Tom is celebrating the concept already.
It's sad that it would come to that, but let's talk about how we get out of this mess. We do it by cutting spending. We do it by reforming entitlement spending. Medicare, the cost of health care is driving our debt, so how do we make sure that Medicare is there for future generations, but do so in a way that isn't immoral to future generations by passing on the kind of debt that we are? And we do it by growing the economy. Since September 30th, we've seen billions of dollars in more revenue to the federal government, not because of tax increases, not because a single rate increased, but because the economy actually grew enough to add more revenue to the federal government. You do that, and we can control and get this debt under wraps.
But what we're, I think, concerned about is how does Congress either trust each other to have these serious conversations, or at least respect differences of opinion at a deep enough level that when they come together, they know they're going to solve all of this, they're going to have to compromise. So I think what a lot of Coloradans and across the country are worried about is, yes, those are hard, and yes, you're taking one side and there'll be another side, but how do you figure out in a very good way in terms of intellectual integrity and and still being true to your own values, and knowing that people with diametrically opposed positions on things all have to somehow come together and craft a solution, and no one's going to get what they want 100%. So how do you work together? How do you trust each other enough in the process of hammering all this out? That's what I'm worried about, is that those fundamental ways human beings solve a problem, when there are passionately held opinions on both sides, how do you make that happen in a democratic process?
And Tom, I'd like your sense of how, how you felt things worked when you were in the House. And Cory, what I'm interested in, similar to what Barbara's saying, is first of all, is there a lack of trust among members? And I don't mean that everyone thinks the other person's the devil necessarily, but just that there aren't the kind of relationships where when you're negotiating with the other side, you have confidence they are going to do what they're promising you to do. That seems to be one of the themes that I'm hearing out of Washington, that there's just not a lot of confidence that if I make a deal, that deal actually is going to happen. Where Republicans really don't trust Democrats. If Democrats make a commitment to cut spending, a lot of Republicans I talk to are absolutely not confident that those spending cuts are actually going to occur. And so I'd like and Democrats, of course, feel the same way about Republicans' willingness to really look at revenue enhancement somehow, and that's not going to happen either. Is there a serious lack of trust, or is that just the normal way things are in Washington and always have been?
Well, I think in certain respects it is going to happen, a element of suspicion over what one party is going to do, or one element of movement is going to do versus what they're saying publicly. It's well documented over the past year in Speaker Boehner and President Obama's negotiations that the Speaker felt the President was moving the bar on revenues going to the federal government, and so that certainly goes to the issue of trust. I don't think this President...
You're saying since the election?
Since the election, as well as going back the past year before the election and prior negotiations. I do believe this president lacks the kind of relationships that other presidents have had with the Hill, and by that I mean both Republicans and Democrats. The relationship building that's happened.
It goes both ways.
Oh, absolutely it does.
There's fault on both sides.
Absolutely does. But I do think that there is a lack of a relationship that this president has as a result of either direction.
Right.
And so,
actually, I think, just to be objective, I think the fault is probably more with the president, and the reason is, president can invite you to the White House. Not too many Congress people ask the president over for dinner and get an affirmative response. And I want to talk about that. We'll talk about that because one of the things that some of the elder statesmen like Al Simpson and Tim Wirth have discussed is how individual presidents have dealt with the Congress and the relationships they have. And I've been fascinated by the extraordinary differences in that. But go ahead.
Well, no, and I think, Tom, I don't know if you may know better than I think President Clinton actually had a pretty decent relationship with Congress in terms of at least reaching out always.
Yes.
Obviously, they didn't always agree on everything, but they did have
Ronald
a
Reagan
better
and Tip
relationship.
O'Neill were really great friends. Yeah. Certainly outside of the
Yes.
Congress and the White House, but you could get together for a beer or whatever else adult beverages they might consume and really get along well, and they did. So
Well,
it
But
can
that
happen,
goes to
certainly.
Barbara's point. That
goes to
makes
my-
Barbara's
that
point.
But
goes to
it
my
didn't
point.
translate into legislative camaraderie.
I think it
that
did.
I recall.
I think it did. I mean, when you look at Reagan, when you look at Reagan's legislative record, there were many times when O'Neill greased the skids, and vice versa. When you look at someone like President Clinton, I think some of his relationships early on were effective. Afterwards, well, that's another story.
I don't remember Tip O'Neill greasing the skids for Ronald Reagan in a congressional sense. I don't recall that. I remember, lot of very
certainly was the
strong.
case when there were tax increases.
I remember when a very really profound moment, I thought, during State of the Union address, and the president and Ronald Reagan picked up the budget. And he said, and if you drop this on my desk, I'm going to be, and slammed it down, and everybody applauded and screamed, yeah, I mean, it was.
It'd break the desk today.
Yeah, that's right.
And they did drop it on its desk, by the way.
Well, and he shut down the government twice, remember, during that time.
But people have different styles, and just because President Obama isn't as gregarious as President Clinton was, all right, that's just a different style. President Bush didn't have beers with anyone and famously went to bed at 9 o'clock most nights. So you deal with people's personal styles. That shouldn't get in the way of the country figuring out how to hash out really complicated issues with an understanding that there has to be a solution, and that means that having people just go into their corner and say, I'm going to close down the ring rather than, debate you, that's not, to me, it's not adult behavior.
All right, we're going to take our last break, and we'll come right back and let Cory have the last word on this. We'll be back with Cory Garnder, Barbra O'Brien, and Tom Tancredo.
There's more of the Aaron Harber Show after this. Coming up next.
The Senate won't pass a budget. Why? Because the president doesn't want the Senate to pass a budget because of the kinds of issues he would have to then run on.